Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Leftists Be Like podcast. I'm your host, Bryson Morris, Donut Morris, on pretty much all platforms. And in today's episode, I am just going to be talking specifically about the distinction between social democracy and democratic socialism, as well as other types of socialism. Just a backdrop 101 on that, as well as a little bit of an explanation into capitalism so that we can further understand the difference between the two and why the difference between the two is important and what it actually looks like today in American politics. The reason that I'm making this specifically is because recently I've seen the growth of DSA and the growth of our third or fourth Red Scare propaganda that we're doing here in America, and the calling everything communist, calling everything socialist, and just the general American ignorance towards what any of those terms mean, as well, that social democracy and democratic socialism are quite different in a few very important ways, and they both get thrown around a lot, and that one specifically actually does have very confusing language on what they actually mean, as well as I see people on the left and the right. I see both sides, even far leftists like communists, which I understand. I guess they use the term social democrat to describe democratic socialists because that's kind of what they are in practicality, but I do see leftists and others throw around the term social democrat in the exact same manner in which you would throw around democratic socialist, and they are inherently different, and I would just like to explain the difference between those two. And in this, in no way is an absolute, endorsement of every single thing about democratic socialism or me saying that I know everything about both of these things, but I do study politics and political theory, so I do think it's important, as well as me technically being a democratic socialist. I am a member of DSA and I'm an organizer for DSA, but let's say I have quite a few criticisms for them, and I'm really here because this is where the people are, not because I fully align with every single thing that they believe in and espouse. I just think it's a pretty good method of organizing and power right now. As well as education, which I hope to be a part of. So let's start off with social democracy, which is probably the one we're more familiar with, whether you know it or not. So social democracy, the way I like to simplify it in my own head, is if you want to look at the political spectrum, or sometimes called the Overton window, as like a line or a spectrum or whatever, and this left-right continuum. Under capitalism, the right would obviously be conservatives, and the far right would be fascist. Center would basically be what the Democrats are now, and then center left would be like the Elizabeth Warren type of wing, and then the actual left under capitalism would be social democracy. So basically the furthest left that most capitalists will ever go. Which is why, besides from anarcho-capitalism, which to me is kind of its own thing that's separate from all of that, I don't even want to touch on it. But that is why a lot of people see something like Bernie Sanders or social democracy as far left or communist or whatever, because we currently, and since basically Ronald Reagan, have been a conservative, a right-wing country under capitalism, especially a libertarian right-wing capitalism. And to that, if you're looking through a window and the window is based in right-wing conservatism, then, someone who's farther left than the center will look far left to you because it is really far away. But ultimately, the inherent difference between social democracy and democratic socialism is that, yes, social democracy is under the spectrum of capitalism. Social democracy essentially sets out to regulate and manage capitalism to the best of a government's ability in order to lessen the inequalities that are basically inherent to capitalism. And that is one of the funny parts to me about social democracy, which I can get more into later, but the regulation of capital and things of that nature, the regulation of the market, kind of admits to itself that they need to be regulated, like that these things are bad, that capital accumulation is bad and billionaires and such are bad, and so therefore it needs to regulate it, it needs to control it, it needs to handle the beast that is a free market or whatever. And it's just funny to me that people would pick social democracy because in itself kind of admits that the system it operates under is poisoned. But I digress. See, the difference there between social democracy and democratic socialism is the socialism of it. Social democracy does not wish to overthrow capitalism. Social democracy does not wish to actually change the system in its entirety or eliminate the system in any way. It just wants to reform the system. It wants the system to be the best version of the system that it can be. Now, democratic socialism, in its actuality, in its idealistic sense, in its practical application, rather than what we're actually seeing right now, like the DSA does not necessarily represent what democratic socialism is, although they are democratic socialists of America. I understand the confusion, but the DSA is not exactly democratic socialism for the most part, and obviously there are a ton of members. But you see someone like AOC, you see someone like Bernie and like Zoran. These people at heart really are social democrats, despite, I think all of them are in DSA or at least heavily endorsed by DSA. Obviously, we just saw the DSA and a lot of its members put out a petition to get AOC for president, and maybe I'll talk about that later. But these at least these three specifically, and many, many more politicians that claim to be democratic socialists, they are social democrats. And this is because they don't actually have any, at least they don't tell us basically that they have any want or need or duty to overthrow the capitalist system. They quite clearly want to regulate it and operate within it. And so if you are operating inside of a capitalist system, inherently you can't really be a socialist one. Now, I will accept the argument. I do think that there is some utility and some use for sure to using our current infrastructure, the way that society is structured right now, to pull on the levers of power and such and change the dynamic of things. But that's ultimately in the goal with the vision of overthrowing the capitalist system, not let's make things better within the system so that we can stay within the system. I say, we can make things a little bit better while we're here, but we're pushing towards something way better, towards something completely different than this structure of society. So things like, Zoran Mamdani endorsing Jeffries to remain leader of the party, things like that are not social, or they are social democracy. They are not socialism. That is not helpful to the goal of building a socialist society. And also, I've genuinely never heard any of those three say that they want to build America as a socialist society, that they want to tear the system down. Most likely because that's kind of electoral poison, being that most people live within the society. However, I don't really care if you're not going to be a socialist. I don't really want to call you a socialist necessarily. And that's not to say that these people are all bad. I think that, I have a picture of Bernie Sanders over here from whenever I was like a freshman in college. Like I've definitely had my moments of really looking up to these people as political figures. I've since grown past that. However, I do think that there's a lot of good that they do. And I do think that there can be a lot of good in straight up just improving people's lives, obviously. However, that doesn't take away the fact that social democracy is ultimately not ever changing. And one of the more important things about social democracy that's different from democratic socialism is that change in the wider society, because when you still operate under capitalism, the main motive is obviously profit. So yes, we may be social democratic and regulating capitalism to the best of our ability. However, we're still under capitalism. And under that structure, obviously there's going to be private property, there's going to be private ownership, there's going to be equity, there's going to be capital accumulation. It's basically just going to be exactly what we have now, except you might have free health care and you might get paid a little bit more at your job. And Elon Musk might not have $1 trillion, but he'll still have $900 billion or something like that. You're making the slave feel better, essentially. And that's not to equate us with slaves, obviously, but in the wage slavery aspect where we have to live, and to live under a capitalist society, we must have money and provide some sort of quote-unquote value or monetary value or labor value to even survive. Hence the saying or phrase cost of being, cost of living. And under that capitalist society, we have to work to survive, and we have to basically make or generate profits for our overlords, our boss, our manager, our whoever is on the board up top of a corporation, investors, things like that. We have to satisfy their needs and actually make them more money than we make ourselves for them to give us a little bit of scraps so that we can then survive. That's still the same under social democracy. It's just that, if you're a nurse, maybe you're going to be making way more than what you need to actually survive, and you're going to be living pretty comfortably. But that doesn't really change things for the immigrant. First off, it doesn't domestically, for sure, social democracy is much better for the people that are actually living in the country. That's just, you can't debate that. Social democracy is better than neoliberalism. It's better than conservatism. It's better than the lowercase L Democrat liberals. It's better than all those. However, it's still capitalism. And under that, one of the most important things that no one ever recognizes, especially when you talk about like the Nordic countries, like the Sweden model, those type of countries that currently have some form of social democracy, there is still exploitation. Capitalism is exploitation. For capitalism to exist, it must always be ever expanding, and it must always be exploiting someone. Because when there is profit, and profit is needed to keep expanding, someone has to lose, because all profit really is extraction of surplus labor value from a worker. So you pay a worker for less than they deserve so that you can make more money on the back end when you sell the thing that the worker has produced. That's capitalism. That's what profit is. So if we're still operating under that, and all of the people in America seemingly, like say America becomes a social democratic state, which, by the way, I'll get into it later, but it kind of was in the 1950s and 60s. But say America radically becomes a social democratic state today, there are still going to be people exploited across the world, because essentially when you have a large social democratic state, and let's say it's just perfect, it's just running on all cylinders, everybody has a great life, then the entire country is winning essentially. And we've established that this is still capitalist, and capitalism requires exploitation. It requires winners and losers. So who's going to lose? It's going to be, quote unquote, the third world, or whatever you would like to call it. I'm not exactly sure on what the perfect terminology academically is these days. I've heard OECD nations or whatever. The third world is going to suffer, and most recently this has been Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, and parts of Asia for sure. So we see with Sweden exploiting parts of Africa and parts of Eastern Europe to make their products and to make their profits. That's just how this works, because capitalism requires a workforce that needs to be paid low wages. So if you decide that you're going to pay all of your domestic workers good wages, then someone still has to be paid low wages. And if you're doing the math there also, the actual profit for the workers, for the working class of the domestic country, is improving. So whose profit is going down? And obviously, to a degree, it's going to be rich people. But if you go and look at Sweden or other social democratic countries, there are still extremely uber rich people with more money than any human would ever know what to do with. So clearly they're not suffering that bad. And a lot of times it's going to be the third world, that working class that's actually doing the labor, that's suffering. That's what we see in a lot of social democratic countries, is they turn their economy into a service economy like America's, where, you're shopping or providing services, because the actual industry and creation of things is outsourced to other countries like China or very, very poor countries in Africa and Asia. That's what capitalism looks like. And so that is the practical failure of social democracy. The theoretical and larger failure of social democracy is it's under the same umbrella that obviously we're still operating under capitalism. The problem is that when you're under capitalism, obviously most of the power is going to deride with capital. The power is going to rest in the hands of money and those who accumulate it, because money runs the system, money runs the market, money runs the entire world under a capitalist society. So who's going to have the power? It's going to be those with money. And, under social democracy, maybe they have a little bit less money. Maybe there's a few less people who are uber rich. Maybe they have to organize a little bit more. But at the end of the day, it's still those uber rich who have the power. And you see this over the course of history, all over the world, especially in Western Europe and America, that when you operate under a social democratic system, it's inevitable that it will be co-opted, it will be taken over by capital again at some point, because it still is being ruled by capital, just in a lesser way. At some point, the ruling class, the capital class, is going to decide to get together and switch this thing up and give us what America has right now. They're going to give us this libertarian right-wing society because that's better for the rich people. Obviously, social democracy is still pretty good for rich people, but it could be a lot better. And when you give them the reins of power, they're going to make it a lot better for themselves. And obviously, they don't care about the working class or the third world. So it's always going to backslide. Social democracy is always going to end up in right-wing capitalism, which, in my opinion and the opinion of most leftist theorists, is always going to end up in fascism. And that is the inherent struggle that capitalism cannot escape, and it's not necessarily meant to escape. It's kind of the point. Fascism is basically just a manifestation of the ruling class in combination with white supremacy and other things taking back its power. That's basically what fascism is. It's just the right wing. It's the ruling class. It's those who have always ruled going, all right, the status quo is getting a little bit too nice to other people for us, and we are going to take those reins of power back and bring us back to something more feudal. That's what fascism is. And at the end of the day, social democracy can't fight that. And there's a lot of reasons to that. And that's definitely something that I think I could go into much deeper in the future. Not something I'm necessarily super well read on at this point, but social democracy is not militant. It's also not super well organized, and it still operates under that capitalist system, which is a system of I win, you lose. It's a system of I'm sorry. Basically, social democracy is saying I'm sorry that I have to take this thing that you also need, but I'm going to not be as well off without it, so I'm going to take it. I'm really, really sorry that I have to do that, but I'm going to take it. Maybe I'll give you 10% of it. Maybe I'll give you a tiny little piece that I can survive without. Whereas something like right wing is basically like, fuck you, and then give me the rest of your shit too. But at the end of the day, you're still taking the shit from the other people. One is just a lot more polite about it. And the actual people living under these systems might have a much better time. Me as a white guy would definitely have, in America, I would definitely have a lot better of a time under a social democratic system than what we have right now. The economy would be better for me. A whole lot of things would be better for me, but still, I will not advocate for it because we need something greater. We need something farther. And ultimately, what social democracy to me and to most leftists represents is basically the ruling class throwing scraps in an attempt to de-radicalize the working class, to soften the revolutionary ideals that people may be having. And that a perfect example of this you see under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected for 4 terms, is probably, if you're an imperialist, if you like America and you're left-wing or a progressive or whatever, FDR has to be the best president because he was such a social democrat. He was basically as far left as you can get on the capitalist scale, economically at least, because he put Japanese people in internment camps and tried to euthanize basically all of Puerto Rico. But economically, he was as far left as you could get on the liberal spectrum, and he did make lives a lot better for a lot of people. He did alleviate the Great Depression. He did lift us out of that. He did improve the lives of a lot of people, and he ushered in a era, about a 30-ish, 34, 1940 maybe ish year era of a somewhat social democratic system under America, where people saw basically the best lives that they had ever had. Now, obviously, we have racism, segregation, Jim Crow, sexism, tons of social issues and tons of issues in America during the late 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But the economic standing of the wider working class was much better during this time. And a lot of that is due to the social democratic nature of the New Deal era post FDR and social safety nets, things like that, plus a 70% highest tax bracket, a progressive tax on people over, I believe in today's money, it would be something like $3 million. So every dollar a person would make after $3 million, not before, but after, would be taxed at 70%. So you'd be making 30 cents on the dollar for every dollar after $3 million. Basically, you make enough money to be very, very comfortable, and then we're going to take a big piece of the pie after that. That's social democracy. That's what it is. And it worked. America was better. People were having a better time economically, and it was a better period of economics. However, look where we are. Look what Reagan did. Even Jimmy Carter basically ushered in neoliberalism to a degree, along with Nixon and such. But yes, the neoliberalism came, and we are now in a far-right era. I mean, this is a normalized level of fascism. Fascism is literally legal now. Like, it is enshrined in law that anti-fascism is illegal. What are we if not a fascist state then? Please explain to me. And so that's what happens. And you see, like in Sweden, you have billionaires and corporations and moneyed interests taking over politics. You see all throughout Western Europe, who are basically pretty much all of the countries in modern history that have done social democracy are in Western Europe or North America. And you see France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, Sweden. They all are having a major rise in the far right now. Even Britain is having a rise in the far right, and even just major conservative values and anti-immigrant values in Britain, much like you see in America. And a lot of these countries have been social democracies or have had very social democratic implementations into their economic systems, and they still all end up here at the far right. This is where it always will end up. And on the exploitation, I forgot to bring this example up when I was talking about it, but a good example of this exploitation that you see into the third world is under Britain. So the British Empire, which was still operating after World War II, although it was neutered, implemented the NHS system, their medical system, which basically gave them free health care, Medicare for all, whatever. Think of it that way, as Medicare for all, I guess. But a socialized medicine system. In 1948, they still had numerous colonies at that time. They were still ruling over hundreds of millions of people. They were still ruling over Palestine at that time. I mean, so many colonies under Britain in 1948, yet their people at home had free healthcare. That's a great way to look at it. And a few years later, they'd be having TV, and they obviously had radios. They'd be getting microwaves, and I think they already had Hollywood at that point coming to their country. So you're seeing in third world countries massive levels of exploitation, just horrifying levels of poverty and death and disease, and it's all under the thumb of the British Empire, while they're getting things like free healthcare, which is essentially, I mean, an extremely modern invention. That is what social democracy really looks like. That's a perfect example of it. It's glaring inequality in the face of great lives for the people at home, who are most often completely ignorant or willfully ignorant of the conditions that they have set upon the third world. And then this moves me on to democratic socialism. So democratic socialism at its face is kind of the more right-wing conservative branch of socialism, if you want to think of it that way. Although it's just kind of reductive because we don't have a socialist society, so that dynamic doesn't really exist. But if it's easier for you to simplify it that way, they do kind of overlap. Like, a lot of the things that social democracy wants are also the things that democratic socialism wants, like the flattening of inequality and such. But the way that we get there is much different. And also, democratic socialism requires the overthrow of capitalism. Now, democratic socialism is an extremely broad category of theory because, DSA would consider themselves democratic socialists, but I would also probably consider myself a democratic socialist. I am under the branch, I guess, or the ideology of someone like Rosa Luxemburg. There probably does have to be some sort of militant, violent revolution. In what way? I don't know. How is it going to look? I don't know. How's it going to end? I don't know. How's it going to start? I don't know. But there probably does have to be some form of violent revolution that overthrows the capitalist government, because ultimately the capitalist, rich, ruling class is not going to give up their power on the ruling class willingly. It's just not going to happen. Why would they give up everything they have if not at gunpoint, obviously? And not that I want that to happen or anything like that. I don't endorse violence, blah, blah, blah. I respect all the laws of my country. But how is the ruling class going to give up their power? Because ultimately that's what society is. It's a history of who has shit and who doesn't. And currently, it's a bunch of rich, mostly white, mostly men, mostly in Western European and North American countries who own basically everything. I think it's something like 2% of the population owns over 50% of the money in the entire world. That 2% is what rules the world. They have all the power, and they also have the next 20% right below them dedicated to upholding this system, because those 20% below them are having a pretty good time of it too. So in that 22% or whatever arbitrary number, the number itself doesn't actually matter, but in that group, you're basically controlling 90% of the world's wealth and economy, which means you're controlling the world. I mean, when you control the economy, you control the money, you control the food, you're controlling everything, ultimately. And so that system is not going to be overthrown peacefully. It just is what it is. And what needs to be understood in that dynamic is the level of violence is... It's on the fault of the violence is on the ruling class. It's on the person who instigated this, which is the ruling class. The ruling class is the one which imposes this system upon us. So it's look at it through the lens of colonization. It's just like colonization. Look at the American or world working class, the world wage slave class. They are all the colonized people. And the colonizer is coming in with guns pointed at them, taking their food, starving them, putting them in the street, killing them with diseases, depriving them of resources that they need, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, all kinds of things. And then when the colonized fights back, when, I don't know, Palestine raises their guns, when China raises their guns, when any colonized people raises their guns against the colonizer, we then shout, oh, violence, we shout barbarians, they're disgusting, they want to kill our way of life. But in reality, it's the colonizer that's came in to exploit this place. And, as Malcolm X said, or was quoted by Denzel Washington as saying, you wouldn't fault the sheep for telling the wolf that you're not going to be eaten anymore. And that's really what it is. The violence is instigated by the ruling class, and it's imposed by the ruling class in a systemic manner. So when we, as the working class, say we want to overthrow this, I do think that we should operate in the most favorable manner as possible to just broader humanity and basic humanity of people. But that doesn't mean that peace is going to work, because in the words of the late great Kwame Ture, nonviolence only works in the face of a ruling class which has a conscience, and ours does not. Which is very clear, obviously. I mean, just look in America as a microcosm. We go out and do these No Kings protests or these marches or whatever, and ultimately, if you have a police escort, that's a parade. That's not a protest. These nonviolent protests, these non-disruptive protests, that does not change anything because it doesn't get in the way. And protest that is any sort of successful has to get in the way. But even more important than protest, in my opinion, is actually organization. I think those protests can be great, and we do need backstops for sure, and we do need to show our outrage, and we do need to spread our message. But I think at large, what's really going to liberate us, what's really going to free us, is the mass organization of the working class to form a more collective unit that can actually stand up in the face of the ruling class. Because, believe it or not, the ruling class is pretty united. I mean, if you look at the DNC and the RNC right now, look at the things that they agree on and the things they don't agree on. The things they don't agree on are these stupid little wedge issues about, small societal changes that ultimately don't really mean anything either way, but they're both basically saying, hey, the Republicans say gay people should all die, basically, and the Democrats say, I'm going to use he, him pronouns, while also, exploiting gay people in society and the economy and such. What we need to say is, let's throw that all out the window and let's actually organize against those people, because you see when the DNC and the RNC want to talk about Israel, or they want to talk about foreign wars, or they want to talk about taxing billionaires or accumulating capital, those things are bipartisan. The ruling class all agrees on that stuff. They all agree on imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, getting as much money as possible. They all agree on that. I mean, you see that there hasn't been a bill passed still for Congress to not be able to bet on stocks. They agree on the ruling class ruling. That will be agreed upon at all times. And that's where we get caught in the left-right trap, quote-unquote left-right, but the conservative-Democrat trap, because ultimately they're both ruling class parties. It's just one wants a fascist reality and one wants to keep this current status quo completely still, which, by the way, under a very radicalized, very polarized, and very angry population, the status quo is going to lose. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it is. The people who want change, the party of change in a time of people who want change, is going to win. And right now that's the Republican Party. And the change they're going to bring is to bring us back to a more white supremacist, more militant surveillance state, some probably not full fascist, probably a semi-democratic state is what I would guess is the goal at the end of the day, because Americans ultimately are not going to put up with full-on, state surveillance over top of them, at least without the appearances of democracy. And I think that would be what the end goal is here. The Republican Party is that appearance of democracy. And that's another thing. The Democratic Party, I don't think, wants that. But you have to understand that liberals and even social democrats, and that there is a lot of history behind this, social democrats and other liberals will side with fascism once fascism's here. I think a lot of social democrats, especially under like a socialist system, would align with socialists given that circumstance. But under the current circumstances, social democrats are going to side with fascism, because fascism is going to come after everybody, especially the left wing, and social democrats are just basically going to become fascists or shut the hell up, essentially, is my prediction, at least. And there's a lot of history behind that. Specifically, like I mentioned, Rosa Luxemburg, she was in Germany before World War I, and she was a member of what they called the Social Democratic Party of Germany at the time. And to be fair to them, they were actually a socialist party, really. The German one, pre-World War I, was a socialist party that was trying to work within the democratic system to turn the system socialist. It obviously failed, and then World War I happens, and post-World War I, who takes over power? The Social Democratic Party. They were given the reins. The Social Democratic Party was given the reins by the international community and the German community post-World War I from the monarchy, from the imperial forces, because they acquiesced to the right and because they moderated themselves and they left their socialism behind and just became a social democratic capitalist system, and then went on to kill leftists, to suppress leftists, and still nuke the German economy. They killed Rosa Luxemburg. The party that Rosa Luxemburg worked within for decades to change Germany into a socialist economy assassinated Rosa Luxemburg after World War I because she was a leftist speaker who spoke out against the capitalist status quo, against the reformist party that was now in power. And that's ultimately what always happens under a capitalist party, a capitalist society, no matter what type of capitalism, no matter what flavor of capitalism. It's ultimately poisoned, and it's ultimately poisonous to the people. So I hope that maybe I enlighten some of you on some things that you didn't necessarily know. If I went over some stuff that you already knew everything about, I'm sorry. Bear with me, please, because I'm not exactly sure of who the audience is for this podcast yet, whether it's like beginners or full-on leftists or whatever, or if I'm just on here talking to Ingalls himself. But I hope that I could lighten some things for you and maybe inspire you to go look further into it yourself. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or anything, any ideas of what you would like to see in the future, please let me know. I am all ears. I would love to have someone else's creative input because I'm not a very creative guy myself. I'm just good at talking and researching. But with that being said, I thank you so very much for listening to this. Please go check me out on all my other platforms. Donut Morris on basically everything. Please like, comment, and subscribe. You don't understand how much that helps me and helps the algorithm. And I will be back very soon, and thank you so much for listening.